Welcome back to the channel, history enthusiasts. Today we're diving into one of the most ambitious and ultimately catastrophic military campaigns in East Asian history. We're talking about Toyotomi Hideyoshi's invasion of Korea, a 7-year war that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives, devastate an entire peninsula, and ultimately destroy the legacy of Japan's most powerful warlord. So buckle up as we explore the rise and fall of the samurai who dreamed of conquering China but lost everything in Korea. Before we get to the invasion itself, we need to understand the mastermind behind it, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Born in 1537 as the son of a peasant foot soldier, Hideyoshi rose from absolutely nothing to become the most powerful man in Japan. No samurai bloodline, no noble connections, just pure ambition and strategic genius. Hideyoshi served under Oda Nobunaga, one of the great unifiers of Japan, and after Nobunaga's assassination in 1582, Hideyoshi outmaneuvered his rivals to claim power. By 1590, he had achieved what seemed impossible. He unified all of Japan under his rule, ending over a century of civil war known as the Sengoku period. But here's the thing. Hideyoshi now had a problem. He had hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened samurai with nothing to fight. These warriors had spent their entire lives in combat, and suddenly there was peace. What do you do with an army that only knows war? Hideyoshi's solution? Conquer China. Yes, you heard that right. Hideyoshi, flush with success from unifying Japan, set his sights on the Ming Dynasty, one of the most powerful empires in the world at the time. But there was one small problem. Korea stood in the way. In 1590, Hideyoshi sent envoys to Korea with a simple message: let Japanese troops pass through Korea to attack China, or face invasion themselves. The Korean court, loyal to Ming China, and frankly insulted by the demand, refused. The Joseon dynasty of Korea had enjoyed 2 centuries of relative peace and had strong diplomatic and tributary ties with Ming China. They weren't about to betray their powerful neighbor for some upstart Japanese warlord. Hideyoshi wasn't taking no for an answer. He began amassing a massive invasion force. We're talking about 158,000 troops in the first wave alone, with plans for many more to follow. This was one of the largest amphibious invasions in history up to that point. On May 23, 1592, the invasion began. The Japanese forces landed at Busan, Korea's southern port, and immediately laid siege to the fortress there. The Korean garrison, unprepared and undermanned, fell within a single day. This set the tone for the opening phase of the war. The Japanese army was divided into 9 divisions, each led by a powerful daimyo, feudal lords who commanded the samurai forces. These weren't just soldiers. They were veterans of decades of warfare in Japan. They had superior firearms, including arquebuses, matchlock guns that the Japanese had adopted from Portuguese traders and perfected. The advance was terrifyingly swift. Within weeks, the Japanese captured Dongne Fortress, then pushed northward. By June 12th, just 20 days after landing, they captured Seoul, the Korean capital. The Korean king Seonjo fled north toward the Chinese border, and it looked like Korea might fall completely within months. The Korean army, which hadn't seen major combat in 200 years, was simply overwhelmed. Their weapons were outdated, their tactics rusty, and their fortifications hadn't been properly maintained. City after city fell to the Japanese onslaught. But here's where things get interesting. While the Japanese dominated on land, the seas told a completely different story. Enter Admiral Yi Sun-sin, one of the greatest naval commanders in history. Yi Sun-sin commanded Korea's southern naval fleet, and he had a secret weapon, the Jeobukseon, or turtle ship. These were innovative warships covered with hexagonal iron plates and spikes, designed to ram enemy vessels and withstand arquebus fire. They were armed with cannons and could devastate enemy fleets. On May 29th, 1592, just days after the invasion began, Admiral Yi won his first naval victory at the Battle of Okpo, destroying or capturing dozens of Japanese ships. Then came the Battle of Sashion, the Battle of Dangpo, and the Battle of Hansen Island, one decisive naval victory after another. The Battle of Hansen Island on August 14, 1592, was particularly devastating for Japan. Yi Sun-sin used a brilliant crane wing formation to encircle and destroy over 60 Japanese ships. These naval defeats were catastrophic for Japan because they cut off supply lines. Remember, the Japanese army in Korea depended entirely on ships to bring food, ammunition, and reinforcements from Japan. While Admiral Yi controlled the seas, something equally important was happening on land. Korean civilians were rising up. Volunteer militias called righteous armies, or Webyong, formed throughout the countryside to resist the Japanese occupation. These weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers, scholars, monks, and merchants who grabbed whatever weapons they could find and started ambushing Japanese supply lines, attacking isolated garrisons, and making the occupation a nightmare. Leaders like Kwan Yul and Cho Haeon organized significant resistance forces that won actual battles against Japanese armies. The Japanese found themselves controlling cities, but not the countryside. Every supply convoy was at risk. Every foraging party could be attacked. The occupation that seemed so easy in the beginning was turning into a quagmire. By late 1592, Korea's desperate appeals to Ming China finally brought results. The Ming Emperor Wanli decided that Japan couldn't be allowed to conquer Korea. It would put Japanese armies right on China's border, so China sent troops, lots of them. The first Ming intervention force arrived in December 1592, about 5,000 troops under General Zhu Chengshun. They immediately marched to recapture Pyongyang, which the Japanese had occupied. But this initial attack failed disastrously, and the Ming forces retreated with heavy casualties. But the Ming didn't give up. In January 1593, a much larger Chinese force of around 43,000 troops under General Li Rusong arrived. On February 8, 1593, they launched a massive assault on Pyongyang. After fierce fighting, the Japanese abandoned the city and retreated southward. This was a turning point. The Japanese advance was finally halted. They'd pushed all the way to the northern border of Korea, but now they were being pushed back. The Ming and Korean forces pursued them, and the Japanese found themselves in an increasingly difficult position. By mid-1593, both sides were exhausted. The Japanese still held southern Korea, but they couldn't push north. The Ming and Korean forces couldn't push them out of Korea entirely, so both sides agreed to negotiate. But here's where it gets absurd. The negotiations were a comedy of errors and deliberate deception. The Japanese negotiators told Hideyoshi that Ming China was ready to surrender and make him emperor of China. The Chinese negotiators told the Ming court that Japan was surrendering and seeking forgiveness. For 4 years, from 1593 to 1596, this ridiculous charade continued. Neither side was actually willing to give the other what they wanted. Hideyoshi demanded that Ming China give him 4 southern provinces, that a Ming princess marry the Japanese emperor, that trade relations be restored, and that Korean princes be sent to Japan as hostages. The Ming, of course, found these demands laughable. Finally, in 1596, the truth came out. Ming envoys arrived in Japan expecting Hideyoshi to accept investiture as a vassal king of China, basically acknowledging Chinese superiority. When Hideyoshi learned the truth, he was absolutely furious. All negotiations collapsed immediately. In January 1597, Hideyoshi launched a second invasion of Korea. This time, he sent approximately 141,000 troops. But this invasion would prove even more disastrous than the first. The second invasion started with a devastating blow to Korea's naval defense. Admiral Yi Sun-sin, the hero of the first invasion, had been dismissed from his command due to court politics and false accusations. His replacement, Won Gyun, led the Korean fleet into a trap at the Battle of Myeongnyang in August 1597. The result was catastrophic. Nearly the entire Korean fleet was destroyed. The Japanese now had naval superiority and quickly occupied southwestern Korea. But here's where one of history's greatest naval miracles occurred. Admiral Yi Sun-sin was reinstated, and he found himself with only 13 ships remaining. 13 ships against a Japanese fleet of hundreds. On October 26, 1597, Admiral Yi faced a Japanese fleet of approximately 133 warships, with his 13 remaining vessels at the Myeongnyang Strait. Any sane commander would have retreated, but Yi Sun-sin famously said, "The enemy is numerous and we are few, but do not fear. Even if you die, do not let the enemy pass." Yi chose the battlefield brilliantly. The Myeongnyang Strait was narrow with powerful currents that changed direction. He positioned his ships to use these currents as a weapon. When the Japanese fleet attacked, they found themselves fighting not just the Korean ships but the sea itself. The result? An impossible victory. Yi Sun-sin's tiny fleet destroyed or damaged over 30 Japanese ships without losing a single vessel of their own. It's considered one of the greatest naval victories in history, Yi Sun-sin commanding 13 ships defeating a fleet 10 times larger. This victory saved Southern Korea from total occupation and restored Korean naval superiority. Once again, Japanese supply lines were threatened, and their invasion bogged down. From late 1597 through 1598, the war devolved into a brutal stalemate. The Japanese held a chain of fortresses along Korea's southern coast, but they couldn't advance further. Ming and Korean forces besieged these fortresses but couldn't capture them all. The fighting was absolutely savage. At the Siege of Ulsan from December 1597 to January 1598, Ming and Korean forces surrounded a Japanese fortress defended by about 10,000 troops. The siege lasted months, with both sides suffering enormous casualties. The Japanese garrison was reduced to eating horses, then tree bark and leather, before finally being relieved. Similar sieges occurred at Sachyon and Suncheon. Each battle claimed thousands of lives. The entire southern region of Korea was devastated. Villages were burned, fields destroyed, and civilians caught in the crossfire died by the thousands. And here's something truly horrifying. Japanese commanders sent back to Japan barrels containing tens of thousands of severed noses and ears taken from Korean and Chinese soldiers and civilians as proof of their kills. These were buried in what's now called the Ear Mound in Kyoto, a grim monument to the war's brutality. By 1598, Hideyoshi himself was dying. The man who'd dreamed of conquering China was now gravely ill, his impossible dream crumbling around him. On September 18, 1598, Toyotomi Hideyoshi died at Fushimi Castle, probably from disease. Before his death, Hideyoshi had established a council of 5 elders to govern Japan and protect his young son, Hideyori. This council immediately ordered all Japanese forces to withdraw from Korea. The war that had cost so much and achieved nothing was finally over. But the Japanese couldn't just sail home peacefully. The Ming and Korean forces were determined to destroy as much of the retreating army as possible. Admiral Yi Sun-sin led the combined Korean-Ming fleet to intercept the Japanese evacuation. On December 16, 1598, the final major battle of the war occurred at Myeongnyang Strait. Admiral Yi Sun-sin commanded a combined fleet of Korean and Ming ships against the retreating Japanese navy. In a night battle lit by fire and explosions, the Allied fleet devastated the Japanese, destroying over half their ships. But victory came at a terrible price. During the battle, Admiral Yi Sun-sin was struck by a bullet. Knowing that his death could demoralize the fleet at a critical moment, his last words were reportedly, "The battle is at its height. Beat my war drums. Do not announce my death." He died in the moment of his final victory. His officers concealed his death until after the battle was won. Korea had triumphed, but they'd lost their greatest naval commander. Yi Sun-sin had fought in at least 23 naval battles during the war and never lost a single one. When the Japanese finally withdrew in late 1598 and early 1599, they left behind a Korea utterly devastated by 7 years of warfare. The death toll was staggering. Estimates suggest between 1 and 2 million people died in Korea alone, out of a population of perhaps 8 to 10 million. That's somewhere between 10 and 25% of the entire Korean population. Entire regions were depopulated. Agricultural production collapsed. Rice paddies that once fed millions were burned or abandoned. Cultural treasures were destroyed or looted. Korean artisans, particularly ceramics experts, were kidnapped and taken to Japan, where their skills would revolutionize Japanese pottery. The war also had profound effects on Korea's cultural heritage. Countless historical documents were burned. The Gyeongbokgung Palace in Seoul was destroyed. Buddhist temples that had stood for centuries were reduced to ashes. The scars of the invasion would mark Korean society for generations. But what about Japan? Hideyoshi's death and the failed Korean invasion led directly to his dynasty's destruction. Remember that council of 5 elders he'd established. One of them was Tokugawa Ieyasu, perhaps the most cunning politician in Japanese history. Ieyasu moved quickly to consolidate power, positioning himself against Ishida Mitsunari, who led the faction loyal to Hideyoshi's son. The tensions exploded in 1600 at the Battle of Sekigahara, the most important battle in Japanese history. Tokugawa Ieyasu's forces crushed the opposition in a single decisive day of fighting. By 1603, Ieyasu was named shogun, establishing the Tokugawa shogunate that would rule Japan for over 250 years. Hideyoshi's son Hideyori was allowed to live, but in 1615, Ieyasu besieged Osaka Castle, where Hideyori and his mother had taken refuge. The castle fell, Hideyori committed suicide, and the Toyotomi line was extinguished completely. Everything Hideyoshi had built, his dynasty, his legacy, his dreams, was destroyed. And it all traced back to the disastrous decision to invade Korea. The war had exhausted Japan's resources, killed tens of thousands of samurai, and created the political instability that allowed Tokugawa Ieyasu to seize power. The war was also devastating for Ming China, though in less obvious ways. The Ming spent enormous sums of silver supporting Korea. Estimates range from 8 to 10 million taels of silver, an absolutely massive amount for the time. This financial burden, combined with other military campaigns and internal corruption, severely weakened the Ming dynasty. They also lost tens of thousands of soldiers in Korea. While China had successfully defended Korea and prevented Japanese expansion, the cost was enormous. Within a few decades, the Ming would face new threats from the Manchu tribes in the northeast. Weakened by the Korean War's expenses and other factors, the Ming dynasty would fall in 1644, just 46 years after the end of the Korean campaign. Some historians argue that the resources spent in Korea contributed significantly to the Ming's inability to defend against the Manchu invasion. The Imjin War, as the Japanese invasions of Korea are known, left a lasting impact on all 3 nations involved. In Korea, Admiral Yi Sun-sin became a national hero, celebrated as the savior of the nation. Today, statues of Yi stand in Seoul and other cities, and he's considered one of history's greatest naval commanders alongside Nelson and others. The war also shaped Korean-Japanese relations for centuries. The memories of the invasion's brutality created deep-seated distrust that affected diplomatic relations into the modern era. Even today, the Imjin War remains a sensitive topic in Korean-Japanese relations. Ironically, the war also led to significant cultural exchanges. The Korean artisans forced to Japan revolutionized Japanese ceramics. Korean books and printing technology influenced Japanese learning. Even as the war devastated Korea, Korean culture left its mark on Japan. From a military perspective, the Imjin War demonstrated several crucial lessons. First, sea power proved decisive. Admiral Yi's naval victories prevented Japan from properly supplying its armies and ultimately doomed the invasion. Second, the war showed the importance of popular support. The Korean Righteous Army's guerrilla warfare made occupation impossible, even though the Japanese won most conventional battles initially. You can conquer cities, but if you can't control the countryside, you can't hold territory. Third, the war highlighted the dangers of overextension. Hideyoshi tried to conquer China with an army that was not large enough and supply lines that were too vulnerable. His ambitions vastly exceeded his means. The Imjin War was also one of the first conflicts where firearms played a major role in East Asian warfare. The Japanese arquebus proved devastating in early battles, but the Koreans and Chinese adapted, and eventually, traditional weapons and tactics, particularly naval warfare, proved equally important. Beyond the strategic and political analyses, we must remember the immense human suffering this war caused. Over 1 million Korean civilians died, from warfare, starvation, disease, and exposure. Countless others were displaced, their homes destroyed, their families torn apart. Japanese soldiers also suffered tremendously. Tens of thousands died in Korea, not just in battle but from disease, starvation during sieges, and the brutal winter conditions. Many who returned to Japan found their homeland plunged into renewed civil war. Chinese soldiers fought and died far from home, defending an ally against invasion. The Ming forces lost thousands of troops in battles and sieges throughout Korea. These were sons, fathers, and brothers who never returned home. War is often discussed in terms of strategy, politics, and great leaders. But we must remember that behind every statistic, every battle, every campaign, there were individual human beings experiencing fear, pain, loss, and grief. So there you have it, the complete story of Toyotomi Hideyoshi's invasion of Korea, one of history's most ambitious and ultimately catastrophic military campaigns. A peasant who became the ruler of Japan dreamed of conquering China but ended up devastating Korea, weakening his own nation and destroying his dynasty. The Imjin War teaches us about the dangers of unchecked ambition, the importance of logistics in warfare, the power of national resistance, and the catastrophic human cost of imperial dreams. Hideyoshi unified Japan, but couldn't resist pushing further, and that decision destroyed everything he'd built. For Korea, it was a war of survival that left scars lasting centuries. For Japan, it was a failed adventure that led to political upheaval and a new dynasty. For China, it was a costly defense of an ally that contributed to dynastic decline. No one truly won. Everyone lost something precious. What do you think about Hideyoshi's invasion? Was it inevitable overreach after unifying Japan, or a preventable catastrophe? How do you think Admiral Yi Sun-sin's tactical genius compares to other great naval commanders? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more deep dives into history's most fascinating events. Until next time, remember that the lessons of history are written in the experiences of those who lived through it. Thanks for watching.